So this is, if you look up in the top right-hand corner, this is Leighton Buzzard. This is Sears Crossing. So about 250 metres, 250 yards north of Sears Crossing is where the amber light was shown. By the time he'd got to Sears Crossing, the red light was shown. They'd sprung the driver and they forced him then to drive down to Bredigo Bridge. And you can see how far Cheddington is further down the track, where the train eventually was stored after to keep the main line running for the morning. They then, once the lorry had been loaded, and it was a military type operation, Napoleon sat there watching them chaining the sacks down, and he said, "You've got 20 minutes." And they got 120 of the 128 out in 20 minutes. And he said, "That's it, we go. Forget the rest." And that was worth something like about £400,000 that they left behind, something like about 8 million. They then took the back roads. They marked it out, they knew the route, but there were little signs that for them that they knew. And in that way, what they did then is they moved from Bredigo Bridge along these types of road, missing Aylesbury, missing these types of area, and just coming along to Leatherslade Farm, which is down here. They were listened to by the police, because by this time the train coming up had been stopped and told that the mail train had been taken, had been stolen from. They headed along the minor roads about 27 miles for 45 minutes, and they holed up at Leatherslade Farm. So Leatherslade, as I said, Leatherslade Farm was bought by Lenny Field and conveyed through Wheaters. Yes, they did play Monopoly. They had a Monopoly set. No, they did not play with money from the Great Train Robbery. That was made up by the press at the time. They did intend to stay there until Sunday the 11th, but they left on Friday the 9th with their expenses and drinks and the £1,747,000 shares. A company smart bottled the clean-up and the torching, and police found the hideout because of a tip-off from a herdsman called John Maris. He had his stock of cows in the field opposite Leatherslade Farm. He knew that Leatherslade Farm hadn't been used and was derelict for years and years, and all of a sudden there was this deluge of people walking around it. So he rang the Crime Stoppers of the day and said, "There's people at Leatherslade Farm," and I think it looked a bit dubious. So by this time, but of course they're listening in to the police radio. They knew what the police were doing, and that's why they left early. That's Leatherslade Farm. Afterwards, you can see one of the Land Rovers. There were 2 Land Rovers. They both had the same registration. Don't know why that was, but anyway. And you can see the Roadster lorry, the Austin Lodestar lorry, and they painted it yellow. Why, I do not know. But while they were at Leatherslade Farm, they did get some paint and paint the outside of the lorry. Oh, there it is. There's the lorry and the police car at the front, and the two Land Rovers at the back. And these were some of the stores that had been facilitated by Karen. And you've got everything from it was a military operation. Everything from soup and bully beef and spam and all the good things, OXO cubes, eggs, coffee, tea, and the knives, forks and spoons and everything to go with it. trays of eggs so that they could cook, and it was going to be their hole for 3 or 4 days. This is where it all broke down. There were too many people investigating it. Buckinghamshire Police were small. So in a small county, they didn't have the manpower. So they took police from Oxfordshire and Northamptonshire and Berkshire and all the rest of the forces around them to try and sort this out. But it was still very big. Another investigator was the British Transport Police. And really, all they were interested in is, well, it ought to go to somebody bigger, and we want to clear the line and make sure that the West Coast Main Line runs. So the flying squad, that's Tommy Butler on the bottom left. He was the head of the flying squad, a very secretive man. And they made a squad especially for the train robbery, and that was of 6 people. And I don't know if you watched the Brinks Mac thing on the television last night. They do that even today. Whenever there is a big job, which Brinks Mac was, they set up a specific squad just to handle that. But it did break down at that time because Tommy Butler and Jim Slipper, who was the head of the train robbery squad, they just didn't talk to one another. And that's why we had the acquittals later on. When Tommy Butler did finish, he was retired, Jim Slipper did take the flying squad, and when these sort of big jobs came along, if any, he was a little bit more cooperative. The Post Office Investigation Branch, all they wanted to know was how much money was been stolen to tell the insurers so that they could get their money back. That's what the Post Office Investigation Branch were there for. And the press, when they couldn't get information from the flying squad or the robbery squad, they would go to some of the British Transport Police or Post Office to try and get information about what has happened. Now, as I say, this happened on a Thursday morning. On Monday morning, after, Roger Caudry and William Bowl, who were holed up after they'd left Leatherslade Farm in a flat in Bournemouth, Roger Caudry went to the estate agents where he'd rented the flat from to pay for a garage. And as he walked in, he reeled off some money from a roll of paper, and the lady who took the money from him was a police widow, and she thought this was rather unusual. So she phoned the police, and that was the first, when the name Roger Caudry was mentioned to the police force and they knew of his activities against trains from earlier times, they became very interested. And within the first month, 11 of the 15 people had been taken into custody. Aylesbury Court was too small, so the council offices were converted into a court and the jury retired to the youth centre next door. The trial lasted 51 days and all were given long sentences except for John Daly, who was free. And they found fingerprints of him at Leatherslade Farm. But because Slipper and Butler didn't talk to one another, that never got put to the court and he was freed. Appeals were asked for more or less directly because they all got nearly 30 years. Appeals reduced the sentences to 25. And as a result of that, the main coordinator of it all, Brian Field, he was freed as well. So, Ethel Clark, who was the police widow, she got 15,000 reward, not from the great train robbery, but like the herdsman that had informed the police about the activity at Leatherslade Farm, from the public purse, a thing like Crime Stoppers is today. You've seen Aylesbury Court. If you've watched Judge John Deed, because after the Great Train Robbery, there was a beautiful building, a court, and you see these photographs outside the court, and they actually used some of the court settings inside to do that program. So if you watch some of their programs, you may. It got into a little bit of a bad state, and in 2018 it was vacated. It's supposed to be made into a hotel. I don't think it has yet, but there may be points going forward for that. Yes, they caught others. Roy Weasel Jones, he was one of the big boys in the bowler hat gang, and worked directly for Napoleon. He enjoyed motor racing. He also became a silversmith, and he produced a trophy under commission from a guy called Bernie Eccleston. And Bernie Eccleston was given this trophy, commissioned, he was commissioned for it, and that trophy went annually to the best sponsor of the motor racing team for that particular year. You couldn't write it, could you? Brian Field, as I say, was acquitted. He divorced Karen and he remarried. He remarried a lady called Sian Hope, and they both died in a car crash. More about that in a second. Jimmy Hussey got 30 years. He served 12. He also committed drug crime. He got 7 years. I don't know why they bothered, because they spent more time in jail than they did actually spending the money, but that's what happened to him. And these are their photographs. Now, I want you to look at the middle one. You've seen it before. That's Brian Field. But he changed his features, and he looked like that. So he claims, and that's when he met Sian Hope, and that's when he married her. It's not that she knew he was divorced, but really she didn't know his background, and nor did her parents. They were driving down the M4 from London towards Wales to go and see her parents. And the lady driver coming the other way from Wales was called Amber Bissoni. Now, you may not know her, but her father was Mr. Teasy Weasy Raymond, the celebrated hairdresser of the time, made thousands out of hairdressing for. And she probably fell asleep, hit the central reservation, and flipped the car over onto the other car, the Porsche of Brian Field, and 6 people were killed. That was Brian Field and his new wife, Sian, Amber Bissoni, her husband, and 2 children. There were escapes. There was an escape from Winson Green, where 4 guys, very respectably dressed, walked in with fake documents and said, we've got to take Charles Wilson to courts. Yes, you've got the right documents, off you go. There's Charles Wilson. And they went outside, got in a car. He went to Paris. There's a reason for that. And then his point around the world where they could go without extradition problems was Mexico. So that's what he did. 11 months later, Ronnie Biggs climbed ladders over the wall at Wandsworth. And what happened there was it had been designed that in their association in the evening, they would all meet in the yard. There'd be a fake punch-up in the yard. It would draw the prison officers in, and in doing that, a ladder would be put over the wall. Ronnie Biggs would climb over the ladder and jump into a Pentechnicon with no roof, lots of mattresses, and then he'd slide down the mattresses into a waiting car, and off he went to Paris. He then carried on to Australia, Panama, Brazil. I'll tell you more about that. They went to Paris for a reason, because there was a guy in Paris they could pay who did plastic surgery, and they wanted to change their features. Now, my father was a copper. He worked on a case about the yacht Julie. Don't hear about it very much, but the yacht Julie was known as the shuttle across the English Channel for the great train robbers. The big problem that they did have is that they could never prove it. That's what happened. He went to Australia, he went to Sydney, and in Sydney, he rang his wife, and his wife and son went over to Australia. They lived there quite happily, and then they moved to Melbourne, where he, as a chippy, a carpenter, he worked for the local TV station as a set maker. He used to make the sets with cutting the wood and one thing and another for that. And it was then realised that Ronnie Biggs was in Australia. In fact, it was put out in Melbourne on that radio station, and they didn't know that he was working for that radio station. But it had all been pre-planned. He had a case ready, and he went home, kissed his wife, and said, "Cheerio, probably never see you again," but that's the way it was. And he got a boat from Victoria, South Australia, and he went across the Pacific to Panama, where he caught a train down to Brazil. In 2001, the Sun newspaper paid for his flight and gave him £20,000 for his story. He was arrested at Heathrow, imprisoned in Belmarsh, and then went to Norwich. They go to Norwich for a specific reason, and that reason is Norwich is called, and I'm sorry if this offends anybody, it's called the Jerry Jail. It has got wide enough paths for wheelchairs and Zimmer frames and things like that. So it is specifically built for the older prisoners, for the disabled prisoners that have got problems. In 2009, he was released on grounds of ill health, and he died in a Barnet care home, aged 84 in 2014. Ronnie Biggs did very little for the great train robbery. He didn't hit the driver, that wasn't him, but they wouldn't divulge who did hit him, but it wasn't Ronnie Biggs. And really, he lived off the escapades that he had afterwards, the escapes and the non-extradition order. When he was in Brazil, he met a lady, he made her pregnant, and in doing that, it sealed his life a number of years, no extradition order, and he was there to support the son that he had helped produce. So, some of the other fugitives. Jimmy White stayed low in the UK, lost most of his money, was recovered in a caravan and a phone box in Surrey. He was spotted in Leicestershire, arrested, and he did 18 years. He served 9, died in 1985, aged 65. Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards, they fled to Mexico, again through Paris. And Buster Edwards had a problem. He and his wife did not like living outside the UK, and they came back. And they came back to the florist stall outside Waterloo Station, which he ran. And he couldn't hack it. He went under one of the bridges one day and committed suicide in 1994. Bruce Reynolds died in 2013. Here's a couple of pictures of those two. That's the picture of Edwards by his stall. Very, very successful business he had there, the florist. As I say, there were ones that got away. There was the Ulsterman, who could have been Patrick McKenna, who was Patrick McKenna, right? The family were absolutely astounded when they were told that he was part of the great train robbery. I bet they were. they had a fairly nice life over in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. But he was a devout Catholic, and he did give a lot of the money to the Catholic Church. A guy called Henry Flossie Smith bought 28 houses, a hotel, and a drinking club in Portsmouth. He died aged 77. Danny Pembroke, he left for America, spent 2 years over there, then returned quietly to Kent. He and his wife had 5 children, and he started a paper and scrap metal cycling business. He died aged 79. Totally unknown is Alf Thomas. We don't even really know his name, but he took his 150,000 and said thank you very much. Hop, who was the train driver that didn't drive the train, was to receive £20,000 as a drink. But he was so astounded at the violence that was dished out to Jack Mills, and he just didn't really want to be there. So he went to the Slade farm, and one morning the next morning he just told them, I'm going home. I don't want any money. I wasn't here. And basically he just walked away from it.